All right, we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Test and Learn community conversation around bigger impacts in testing. I'm glad you can all make it. As a reminder, those of you who can do so, please mute your microphones so that we can avoid the feedback issues that can potentially happen. And I want to introduce everybody to our panel. So this is our panel this week. First up is Stephanie Lambert, currently of Career Education Corporation. Prior to that, she was actually at Express.com, and I met her in her role supporting Kohler. So she has more than 6 years of experience in A/B testing, and her current focus is driving the website strategy from beginning to end with the 2 websites for career education. So welcome, Stephanie. Number 2 is Melanie Hall, currently with American Express. She's got more than 7 years of experience in optimization program leadership and strategy. And beyond that, another 10 plus years in program and project management. And before American Express, I met Mel at Dell, where we both worked with optimization program there. Third on our list is Valerie Kroll with UBS. She got started in the optimization and analytics space a while back, but in 2013, she was the person who actually established the digital analytics practice for the American Medical Association. And she's currently serving as Director of Digital Analytics and Optimization at UBS. I met her at the Digital Analytics Conference, where everything that came out of her mouth on every huddle was insightful and interesting. So I thought she would make a great addition to our group. And then we have, lastly, David Torciano of NBC Universal. He has more than 9 years as a digital strategist, primarily in the New York area. And he has served as the Director of Online Optimization for the New York Times. And if you didn't attend our conversation about Journey Analytics 2 weeks ago, I highly encourage you to check out the audio, because David asked some of the best questions. And so welcome, panel. Glad you guys are all here. And let's get started. All right, so I have a list of questions and topics that have been sent in ahead of time and things that the panel has expressed interest in, and we'll start there. But please, again, for our participants on the call, feel free to jump in at any time if you have additional questions or thoughts. And I want to start with the kind of a big picture question that came up a couple of times at the conference recently about the seeming conflict potentially between the focus of your testing program. Is it to learn and drive decision making, or is it to drive impact and a bigger impact? So if you have that philosophical question and there's only they're competing with each other, what are the ways that you guys have made decisions related to what the focus of your program should be, and or how have you managed to do both? And since it's kind of our opening question, we'll just go in order of your names on the slide. So we'll start with you, Steph.
Hi, everybody. I think this is an interesting question. In my current role as CEC, we're a lead gen site, and so we really focus on that area and on those big impact areas to our lead generation. But we also do a lot of UX, so we want to improve user experience. So I would have to say that the lead gen does take up probably about 80% of our A/B testing roadmap, and then the rest is left to kind of UX testing. And in UX testing, I think we probably learn more from UX testing. I mean, we obviously have kind of an end result with our lead form and lead gen testing, but it's a very specific question that we usually answer, whereas the UX, we can get a lot more learnings from them, learn about our audiences, and that's always pretty beneficial. But there really isn't a push or pull, because lead gen is our main goal, so that's kind of where we focus.
That was me on mute. How about you, Mel?
So this is a constant struggle. We're a fairly young, I consider us to be a fairly young program. The testing program has been in place for a little over 3 years. And so sort of, went over hearts and minds, we definitely started off doing a lot of validation kind of work, because that was something that we could get our product owners to understand. Hey, you're thinking about this new thing. Let's try out this new thing before you deploy it and see how this new thing does before you make a big commitment. So that is definitely where we started, and everybody's fully bought into that strategy. We've kind of shot ourselves in the foot with it, because it is at least half of our roadmap at any given time, is sort of validation testing.
Sure.
However, we do have a prioritization matrix that I try to utilize, and I do give weight to strategic initiatives, things that are more innovative, things that are more experimental, that's pushing the envelope a little bit more and taking more of a calculated risk. So we do give weight to those things, but I have to say it's difficult to fit them in with all of the real true business asks that we're kind of caught up in.
Sure. How about you, Valerie?
So I actually haven't had the pleasure of testing at an organization where I have a buy button or my key business KPIs or something that happens online. So I've tended with the programs that I've worked with to focus on testing to learn more about our users and using it as a source of like understanding their digital body language and just to get to know them better, and especially with like message testing, because you can pull that into so many other parts of your business, not just digitally. And so we try to use it as like a composite for kind of understanding those personas and building up what we know about them. So that's our primary focus, but it's a struggle.
Yep. How about you, David?
Yeah, I would say that we tend to lean towards more the bigger picture learning. I've found in the past that when people can't make a decision, they say, "Oh, let's test it," and I say, "No, let's not," and just make a decision. So, we've actually, I don't want to say limited, but really kind of put a strict filter on what is passable for an A/B test. And if it's just something that needs to be decided on, we really just try to push back on that and really just try to, come up with a true hypothesis for what we're trying to understand from the users. And similar to Valerie, just try to understand, is this something that we can use across more than just this one specific instance? So we don't really do too much of the kind of smaller moving parts or, colors or stuff like that. If it's like a big value proposition, or if it's a new product, well, not so much here in terms of product, but a new vertical or offering, right, or a kind of new design concept, we'll kind of test those. But by the time we get to testing, we've already gone through multiple iterations of user testing and feedback from users in like a beta group. So testing is kind of like the end of the road for us.
Sure, that makes sense. Well, a couple of you mentioned different prioritization, which happens to be the second item on the list. So let's just dive into how we can use prioritization to make sure that the right tests are floating to the top, whether they be tests that are focused on providing you the most potential scalable insight. Because if you think about it, if your goal is getting a bigger lift, you need to make sure you have the right tests. And if the right tests that are going to have the biggest impact on your program aren't floating to the top, prioritization schemes from matrices to scoring methods, there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can get there. So I'm real curious what you guys use to make sure that the right tests get to the top. Any of you want to start with that?
I can start. This is a topic that I'm like super passionate about, just because I think it provides so much direction to your program. And even before you pick what model you're going to use or scoring, to your point, there's lots of different choices. I think one of the really key things is also, to go back to what David was saying, is deciding like what you're not going to test, and just kind of like put some rules around the goals of your program. Because being able to say no, to stay focused on like what you're trying to achieve in a quarter is really going to help you focus. But I can't talk enough about the PXL model, or a version of that kind of is more custom to your business. I started out by using Pi and ICE and some of those more simplistic, like you just need to answer 3 questions and then you'll get the score and they'll float to the top. But I noticed that very few people were willing to say, hey, Val, I have this test idea, but it's probably not going to win and it's probably not going to have a big impact. Like it just doesn't happen. And so there wasn't a lot of differentiation in the scoring. So the PXL model out of Conversion Excel asks more questions, but they're more binary, yes, no. Like, is it above the fold on the page? Yes, no. So that gets credit. And if it's further down, it doesn't. And maybe that's not how you want to prioritize your test, but think about what questions you could ask yourself. And maybe it's 10, maybe it's 12, to kind of focus on the things that are going to provide you more value. So the PXL model also gives a lot of credit to test ideas that come from data sources like usertesting.com, or I saw this in analytics, like I really think we need to explore this. So that's a really great way that I think it's like a really good tried and true method, and it provides a lot of differentiation in those tests so that you can see like what's going to matter the most for your program and your goals.
Awesome. I think, David, you were about to say something.
Well, first, it depends who asks for the test. But I think we also, as part of the request, just ask people what they think a lift would be for this. And if the request is a viable A/B test versus like an optimization where we should just throw it into like multi-arm bandit or something like that, I would say like 90% of the time, what people think of our A/B tests are really just an optimization problem. So that's kind of like the first.
Stop for a second, because I don't think a lot of people on the phone are going to understand what you just said, and it's really important. Especially if we're talking about bigger lists, can you unpack for the rest of the group what you mean by what kind of request fits for A/B versus a machine learning automated multi-arm bandit?
So I guess this goes for our prioritization as well, but the crux of understanding whether or not we should be running a test is, what is the hypothesis? And most people just have a question and they don't actually have a hypothesis. And a hypothesis also entails what your expectation is for a lift. So if you were to look at like a frequentist approach to hypothesis testing, you should come to the experiment with an expected lift, and then you calculate what your sample size needs to be in order to see that change. And if you don't see that change by the time you collected that sample, then your hypothesis is null. Most of the times that we get a request for A/B testing, it's just, hey, we want to test this and let's wait until we reach statistical significance, which most statisticians wouldn't accept those results. Mm-hmm. But when we're talking about like optimization, whether it's machine learning or some other algorithm, it's really just, hey, I think that this headline or this value proposition might be doing better than this other one that we're currently running. The reality of the matter is you probably have segments of users. So one value proposition might work better for one group of users based on a set of characteristics that we can identify them by versus another set of users. So you should really throw it into, depending on what A/B testing or optimization system you use, typically they'll have like a straight A/B testing where you're splitting the results 50-50 or whatever the percentage is that you want, versus allowing the algorithm to find these characteristics that identify these different segments that respond better to one version of the value proposition or the other.
Right.
So 90% of the requests that we get is more of an optimization problem.
Right.
Whereas an A/B test is really a fundamental question for the business.
And it's scalable, right? If we test A versus B, what have we learned that we can then scale and apply to future decision making or other parts of the site? If you test headline versus headline, all you've learned is that headline B outperformed headline A, and you don't know why, and you can't apply that elsewhere. But if you have headline A, B, C, and D, and you let machine learning do it, it's going to pick the right headline for the right segment, and you're going to get your optimization, which in the end of the day might be the bigger lift you're looking for. And unfortunately, it's the biggest challenge I have. Clients come forward with this list of A/B tests that they want to do, and none of them are A/B tests. They're all machine learning optimization opportunities.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's A/B testing is too manual. So by the time you find what the winner is and roll it out, it's already outdated. So it's better to have those types of optimizations be put into machine learning or multi-arm bandit, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and I just realized that I forgot to call out that Melanie actually is only going to be with us for the first 30 minutes of our call today because she got pulled into another a meeting. So Mel, I want to give you a chance. Do you have anything in specific you want to mention about prioritization or how to make sure that the right tests are the tests that get put on the roadmap?
Yeah, I mean, our prioritization process is very tactical. While, you know, we are driven to go after the more strategic initiatives, like I said, it's hard to get the business thinking along those lines. So we are definitely looking at the opportunity, opportunity sizing. We do we have some level of pre-analytics on everything that we do from a testing perspective. So we don't just do things because people ask us to. There has to be some data available to prove it out, to help us size the opportunity. Now, I will say, we're also not an e-commerce site, right? So we're not measuring conversion on most things. Conversion is a factor for some parts and pieces of the site, but we exist to service our card members. So that is the other tricky part is keeping a balance of optimization opportunities that are really around servicing card members but don't have any kind of direct revenue impact versus those things.
Sure.
Those things that do. So we do have a prioritization matrix. I would say we use it only when we are getting to a point where, first of all, if we need to be able to say no, we use it as proof of, like, hey, what you're asking for it doesn't rate against all of these other things that we have. Look at our matrix and you'll see why. I wish that we were more tied to it in what we actually deliver, but of course it comes down to a lot of times things that are tied to KPIs on a yearly or quarterly basis. So that's kind of where we are.
Steph, do you have any thoughts to add to it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's so different for every company. It's very personalized. I mean, all these topics that we're talking about are very personalized to the company and what your goals are, what you're trying to achieve. For CEC, again, right now we're focused on lead generation. So anything that's going to be basically, the closer the test is to our forms, the higher prioritization it's going to get. If it's testing the form fields on a form, or an overlay. Recently, we tested an overlay and saw excellent results with that. Those are the things that we're going after the fastest. But at the same time, thinking of different swim lanes and things of that, we have to be careful of testing too much of that at one time, or maybe we only want to roll out one of those at the same time. So then that's where we give room for things that maybe are a little bit more learning versus specific to the form. So it might be something on the home page that we want to drive more traffic into, further into the funnel, or answer more of our visitors' questions because we know that we're not answering them well on the home page. And so we can kind of mix and match test that way. But we kind of start a little bit backwards, where we state, all right, our goal is to run so many tests per month, because over time we kind of understand how much we can handle. We know about how long we want each test to run, and those types of calculations and things like that. And then we roadmap it all out. So we do a lot of pre-planning. At least we've started to do that, to roadmap everything out so we can fit certain things in. And I think that holds a lot of weight, because by the time we actually start rolling tests out, we have buy-in from all the different departments in the organization. And instead of them coming to us and saying, oh, we just want to run this A/B test because we have a question we want answered, or all these things, these challenges that we all deal with, they already know that the roadmap is already built out, and they have to have a really good business case for us to change the roadmap to fit something different in. And that kind of helps a lot with priority, because it forces everyone to really think about what are the top main things that they need to achieve their goals.
Right. And what kinds of requirements do you put in there for your roadmap? Like Melanie mentioned, everything has to have some kind of data and evidence behind it. How are you guys feeding it? Where do the ideas come from?
It's all from data. All from data, user studies. Everything that we do is, I wouldn't even say that we prioritize things that have data. We're not interested in things that aren't backed up in data. So even if it's something small, I think David had mentioned they don't do a lot of tests on just colors and this and that. We don't do that either. We still get some requests for that here and there, and we will ask for why are they pushing for this? How will it help them? How will it help the business? Some departments might have trouble. They might not be analytics departments. They might have trouble getting to the data. So, we can work with them and try and pick their brain to determine what are they trying to achieve with this, and is this really the right test to help them achieve that, or is there something else that we can do? And so we'll kind of pick their brain, learn what they're trying to achieve. We know the data. We can dig into the data for them if they need to, but we're not going to prioritize. We're not going to run anything or spend our efforts on anything that isn't backed by data somehow.
Awesome. Valerie, were you going to add something? I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, just two other things I just wanted to mention. One thing that whenever you're thinking about whatever framework you want to use, I think one thing that has been really critical is for me is making sure that it's objective and transparent so that people understand how it works. So a really good way to test that is to have like a couple hypotheses and have someone from your marketing team, someone from your product team go back and try to prioritize it using the same framework. And if you end up with the same number, then you never have to talk about it again. Like, I hate wasting airtime in a meeting debating whether something should be scored a 3 or a 2. Like, it should just be focused on like,
that's a great point.
Out the door. And then the second thing is just to go back to David's point, and I think Melanie a little bit too, talking about the expected lift. So if the test idea comes from me or someone that works with data, like they always have that number in mind. But I've never had a UX designer able to articulate what they think an expected lift of a test is. And so one of the ways that I've worked around that, and perhaps this is just a maturity thing, but we just come up with some threshold. So if it's a test in web or on a certain set of pages, we look for an expected lift of 15% or higher. Or if it's on email, we can withstand something that's a little bit lower because the opportunity cost of switching a subject line, like it's not going to be too much weight to just change it versus, changing, the whole layout of your homepage or something like that. So if that number is really hard or that's really key to your prioritization criteria, if that's something you want to calculate, try to take some of the pressure, the weight off of the people who might not be able to come up with that number because they might have a really good idea, but kind of scared off from some of the rigor that you put into it. So.
Sure. Other things that I've seen people do in that scenario is they've looked at the average lift for similar test or tests in that area or with that type of focus or whatever. And what I like to tell, in fact, I just got off a conversation with a client who asked this very question, what do I do if I don't know the lift, the estimated lift, is I like to say, how big of a lift would your business partner need to see in order to make a decision? And, if they'd be willing to make a decision with a 1% lift, then that's your minimum. Of course, that ends up getting really challenging because you'd have to run a test a really long time in some situations to see that 1% lift, but that's when you then go back and apply your own knowledge of the data to pick a run time, or perhaps if you have the calculator that you can look at it, you can also look at how long you're willing to run the test because sometimes you have limits due to other unavoidable things like in the retail world there's holiday, or there might be a marketing campaign that's going to launch on this date and you have to have your results by then. How big of a lift would you need to see in order to have your results by that date? And then you put that into your prioritization schema. So there's lots of different ways to get there, but from my perspective the most important piece is how big would it need to be to make a decision, because sometimes you pick a number and then you run for it and you get those results and you got that number and then they're like, yeah, but that wasn't big enough to make the change, and you've wasted a bunch of time and resources.
So, well, I guess if somebody can go on mute, there's a little bit of background noise. But one thing I was just going to add to that was you can kind of work backwards too if you know how much time and effort you're putting into developing a test. You kind of know the number of people hours that you're putting in, and I've been trying to find a way to do this actually in one of my positions. But if you know kind of the amount of time and energy and salary, quite honestly, that's going into developing a test, you need to have a minimum lift to be able to cover just the investment at which that test is going to take, not to mention additional lift on top of what the business is going to make to make it worth it.
And that's really challenging because most people aren't even capturing that information.
I would just add to that in that like level of effort, also thinking about like once you know what's the level of effort to roll it out. So if you're working on a product that only has 4 releases a year and it's going to be really hard to prioritize that winning test if it's only a little bit of a lift relative to like product enhancements,
Sure.
you should count that weight too on the back end.
Yeah. Melanie, any last thoughts before you have to jump?
I don't have any really sage words of wisdom here. I think Stephanie's already highlighted the fact that, you know, how you go about doing this is very much dependent on your business and what your KPIs are. I love Valerie's thought about keeping it transparent and objective. I think that's, you know, that's key when it comes to prioritization and keeping everybody on the same page. So lots of great thoughts. I wish I could stay and listen to the rest because I'm learning from you guys, but unfortunately.
Yeah, well, business calls.
Yeah.
All right. See you
Thanks
later,
for
Mel.
having me. Bye.
All right. Let's dive into KPIs. I think that's those were mentioned a couple of different times about making sure that you have the right KPI. And if I unpack it a little bit with how are you going to get a bigger lift, there's a couple of different triggers that you typically have. One is make sure you have more traffic so that you can actually measure the lift. But the other side is to make sure you have the right KPI selected in order to actually see a lift or see an impact from the changes that you're making. And then you fall into this problem where so I'm going to create an A/B test, and the goal of the A/B test, the thing that I'm changing, is really has as its focus driving people to the next step in a process, and I'm trying to make that easier for them to get to that next step. But I don't want to drive unqualified traffic to the next step, so they just bounce when they get to the next page instead of bouncing from the first page. So if you think of it as a 3-step process, and my goal is to get from 1 to 3, and I've made a change on step 1, what kind of KPIs do we use so that we make sure that we're measuring the change, but we're also keeping in mind that we want to move qualified traffic, not unqualified traffic? How do you guys approach that selection of KPIs?
So this is Steph. I can start on this one really quickly. For us, we actually break out our traffic into a couple different areas, one being students, so you know, visitors who are already students in our school,
Mm-hmm.
And then of course we have people who are not students. We don't have any of their information, so we call them prospective. And then there's a middle ground there of lead nurturing, so people who have given us their information but they haven't actually enrolled or attended our school yet. So those are kind of our 3 swim lanes, if you will. And we will, for the biggest lift, we're obviously going to go for the prospective traffic. So that's where we focus a lot of our time and energy, so that we can get people who are coming to our site, get them the information that they need and generate leads. So that's one way to really qualify the traffic. And we know that we're going after, you know, everyone who is seeing this particular test, this lead test, is actually somebody who we believe wants more information and would actually convert into a lead, and we're removing all of the other traffic that's not. Now, one thing that comes up with that is, you know, you have less traffic to work with, and I don't know if this is a discussion for another day, but one way that we have found that works well for us is using a one TLT test approach. So there's all these different stat models that you can use. There's the 2 that we were looking at is the one TLT test and the 2 TLT test. The 1 TLT test requires less traffic for you to get to stat sig. And the reason being is that it's really only telling you if the variant did better than the original. The 2 TLT test needs more traffic because it's telling you if it did better or if it did worse. For our particular purposes, we are really only interested if the variant performed better than the original. I don't really care if it did worse, because if it did worse, if it didn't do better, we're not gonna roll it out, basically. So that allows us to get more traffic in the test while we are continuing to focus on only the quality of traffic we want to test to. And then as far as KPIs, you know, that is completely dependent on what we're trying to achieve and the test we're trying to run. If we're going after a form test, it's going to be how many people initiate the form and how many people submit the form. We also go as far to, on certain tests, is to look down the whole funnel, the back end funnel. So how many of those leads were quality? How many actually were accepted leads? How many of those, was it a junk lead? Because we want to ensure that we're not just getting more people to fill out the form, but that they're actually people who are interested in our school. And then quickly, if it's a test more further ahead of the funnel, homepage, something like that, we're going to be looking at exit rates. To Kelly's point, we're going to be looking at getting people further down the funnel. We always include conversion, and conversion for us is completing a form. But when you're testing something that's far away from the form, it's a very, very secondary measure, and we dig in a lot deeper to KPIs that are much more relevant to the action that the visitor is actually trying to take in the test versus just looking at one large KPI. I don't know. I think if you looked at one KPI for all of your tests, you would probably rarely meet stat sig and wouldn't get that great of guidance.
Interesting. I just got a good chat question that I'd like to bring up because it's relevant to here. Because you just said if you're using one tail because you're only interested in what's better because you're not going to implement it if it's not. But the flip side of that is that a lot of folks use testing for some, risk mitigation or a measurement of loss. I wish Mel hadn't dropped because she could tell the story better than I can. But an example that we've had in the past, that a test that Mel actually ran, Dell wanted to add a savings message basically on their high-end products, and the brand team felt it was very important for the high-end brand to never show a sales price. Even if it was on sale, you show the final price, but you don't show the savings because that would devalue the brand. And so we contrived a way to run an A/B test to measure the impact of the conversion for actually showing the sale. And then concurrent to that, we ran a usertesting.com and a focus group study showing customers Dell branded products of this particular brand on sale, not on sale, and then some competitors as well with the sales messaging and without. And we asked them to, rank the quality of the brand and the value of the brand and that kind of stuff across all those different categories. And the result of the test was that we found out, on the A/B testing side, it absolutely increased conversion. It also interestingly increased AOV, but that wasn't part of our hypothesis and the result in RPV. And then on the other side, we found that it had no noticeable impact on the brand quality and value. So very interesting outcomes and really helpful. And the reason I wanted to bring it into this is because a lot of times a test like that, you truly need the A/B test because you're going to make a decision that is site-wide. And the KPIs that you select may not all be something that you can actually put into your A/B testing tool. So I'm really curious if any of you have any experience in using A/B testing to do some of that stuff that we actually did outside of A/B testing and to measure risk to the organization.
I haven't done too many tests, at least recently, that I can recall that were focused on risk to the business. Mm-hmm. I'm really focused on NBCnews.com, Today.com, and MSNBC.com. And oftentimes one of our main kind of metrics is return visits.
Interesting.
And that is very challenging, especially in the news in the news world. So trying to understand loyalty, which is our kind of KPI, you can't really measure loyalty. It's multidimensional, it's emotional, it's
sure
actual physical response. So we try to look for metrics that are correlated to some of these KPIs, and what are some of the behaviors that we see that we can track that we believe are showing people becoming more loyal to the brand. So we try to look for something a little bit closer to the actual experiment that we're running at the time. But we also try to
reverse things that seem to reduce loyalty.
Typically, no. I mean, we'll look at it maybe from an analytics point of view, but we're not going to kind of design and then implement an A/B test to test those things. I think, though, at least within our industry, it's, people are really interested in content, and brand doesn't tend to have too much of a driver unless you're at something like the New York Times or the Washington Post,
Sure.
where, the brand is a driver of why people come back.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, what we try to do to make sure that we're looking at the right metric is just understand what the problem is. So in the example of like going to the next step, if from our perspective, a next step would just be maybe a different article. So the way that I would probably attack that is look at the people that are doing the behavior that we don't want them to be doing. So somebody who comes, reads an article, stays for less than 30 seconds and bounces. We would try to then get some information from those folks. So pop up a survey and just ask them, what about the experiences leading you to leave, and try to look for some themes perhaps that can indicate what is driving that behavior, and then try to come up with a hypothesis about how we can then negate that behavior.
And then you design an A/B test to improve the loyalty, not to measure
right, or going to a next article, because we believe that, we know that there's a certain amount of correlation between people who read multiple articles and tend to come back. So part of the short-term strategy is can we find the right piece for that person to be interested in, so that they're reading one more piece or watching another video, versus, hey, can we get this person back within 30 days? That's just, not something that we can.
So what on-site behaviors and actions are correlated with our end goal of return visits? And then how can we encourage those things? That makes sense. And that's how you can see it. Were you going to say something, Valerie?
Yeah. So I don't necessarily have any additional advice on picking the right metrics. I just have to say that even if you're pretty new to your program, or you're testing with a new client or new area of your site, even if you're not to a point where you're like pulling your data down and doing a bunch of fancy stuff in the back end, I know that there's in Optimizely, you can add a bunch of different goals to monitor not just your primary KPI, but also some secondary KPIs, because unless your test is driving a lot more volume to that page, you need to understand that those actions of someone that's doing something more that you want them to do is going to likely come at the cost of other actions on the page. And especially if you have 2 or 3 things that are on the same level of importance right after that primary KPI, you want to watch that cannibalization of action. And so that was really helpful for us. And my second point is, no matter what metrics you pick, make sure that you and whoever you're working with on this test are kumbaya, bought in on what they are before you go. Because otherwise you get into a situation in the back and they're like, well, that wasn't the most important thing. And so, you just want to make sure that you remove that from the conversations on the back end.
Yeah, everybody's got to have alignment going in. I totally agree. Steph, you got anything on KPIs?
No, but I can say that, with a couple different organizations that I've worked with, where we are now is it's a smaller team. We have a lot of different partners, but it's a smaller team, and we own everything on the website in partnerships with a lot of these other teams. But it makes it night and day easier for what Valerie was just talking about struggling over KPIs and what tests to run and if this is most important. We don't have to really deal with that a lot here now. At Express and Kohler, I did. And it makes it really, really nice. We're able to move a lot faster because ultimately our partners just want the end result, and they put a lot of trust in us to get that end result. And as long as we're showing that result is happening, they're kind of fine, almost like staying out of our hair a little bit, if you will. So we're able to focus on the KPIs. We know what our goals are. We know what our partners' goals are. And we prioritize our roadmap to hit those KPIs that they need. And that kind of makes it very easy to know what our KPIs should be. So if our brand team wants to put out have a whole different brand messaging they want to put out there, we can test it for risk mitigation, to your point earlier, Kelly. Then we would want to really determine and just make sure that it's not hurting anything. And that's kind of a totally different approach than a lot of the tests that we do for lead gen, which we really just want to see an increase in leads. So it's it very much depends, the KPI, on what the goal is and what the test is.
All right, let's do, I want to invite our guests that are listening in, all the other TLCers that are on the phone. I want you guys to be thinking of questions that you might have. You can raise your hand, you can go off mute, you can put it in the chat, whatever you want to do. But be thinking of those things as we do a roundtable really quick. One question that I just got through the chat that I want to approach to all of you guys, because last time we did it, it worked really well, and it was the tips and tricks. But in this case, I would like us to go through a couple of rounds of tips or tricks, or an example that you have of how you tweaked a test idea, or possibly a test that actually ran, and then you did an iteration to get a bigger lift. And what works for you, what has worked to get a bigger lift. And it can be anything from, I got the right target audience to, I flipped the switch to machine learning, whatever tricks have worked for you. And we'll just go in order. So I'll start with Stephanie.
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think, this is kind of obvious to me, I guess, but the best way, the biggest lift, how you're going to get the biggest lift is introducing something completely different on your site that you have not done before. At least that's from my experience. That's usually when we've seen, for me, retail and lead gen, that's when we've seen like 40% leads in revenue at Kohler. We introduced a completely different way of going about our cart. We didn't have an item, we didn't have a feature on the cart that we added in, and we saw a 40% lift. Kelly, you were there for that one. That was one of the first ones we ran at Kohler. At CEC, we never did a form overlay, like a pop-up overlay. We tried that. It was something that the company was hesitant trying. We saw a 42, I think, % lift in leads on that one. And then we also tried we knew our visitors, we offer them tuition information, but a lot of them still just couldn't find it or wanted something better. So the team worked really hard even before I started here at this company on developing a tuition calculator, and we gated it. We've never had something like that on our site. It's now our 4th largest lead generation tool that we have available to us. So if you really are going after those big lifts, I think you have to really think outside the box and determine what is it that you're not giving your visitors that they want, and really take some risks and try some things.
So
as far as tweaking things, something new is something different. As far as tweaking things, once you start with something new, there's just a million different ways, a million different things to try. So one quick example is once we tried the overlay, we tried a new redesign of it. We saw a very small lift from it, but then we tried removing some form fields. That was a big challenge for us because historically the company wanted to keep those form fields. We were able to finally get kind of sign off to test removing the form fields. We saw, I think, a 25% lift in form submits from that. So I think it's just being willing to take risk.
Awesome. Mel's not here. Valerie?
Sorry, I was on mute. So totally agree with testing the big ideas. I try to preach the concept of testing for the global maxima with a lot of people that I work with. And one of the ways is to make sure that you're creating a safe space for people to fail. And so instead of measuring win rate as one of our program health metrics, we actually measure what we call an insight rate. So there's a winner, you could have a loser, you can have no winner or we don't know. And so the only one that counts as like bad or negative is the one where we didn't know, which usually is like a flaw of like estimating where our conversion would fall out and just like, a methodology issue. So if we say, as long as we learned something, it was gravy, then like the free flow of ideas from all different places in the organization is where we found a lot of big lifts, just different perspectives. People are closer to different parts of the product. At my last job at the American Medical Association, one of my biggest wins actually came from one of the developers who wasn't even really a part of a lot of the brainstorming sessions initially, and it really opened my mind to how many areas of the organization I could get good test ideas from. So
awesome. David?
So I think there's one test that I will probably reference for the rest of my life because it's probably changed the way that I see my career. When we were at the time, when I was at the Times, we were testing the paywall, and we were testing a lot of kind of product-centric messaging. So you can get the New York Times on your phone, tablet, or computer. And we did a focus group, and we learned people don't care. We learned that the value proposition for people were much deeper, and it was much more emotional. So we took a lot of the findings, maybe it was 100 pieces of feedback that we got from the focus groups. We distilled it down to 8 different variants in terms of imagery and value proposition. And we saw that all of the variants that we tested against the control had like a 20 to 30% lift in terms of actual subscriptions. So, millions of dollars. And what I realized from that was that if you're not testing things that matter to your customer, and not just ideas that we have internally to the building, because oftentimes those ideas don't matter to people, it's just a waste of time.
Yep.
So it's actually led me down the path of trying to understand what people outside of our buildings are what they find valuable, what do they find annoying, what do they find that they want an improvement on. So I do agree that testing something new tends to have some of the larger lifts that I've seen as well. And I think the comment about risk as well, taking on risk tends to be the biggest issue within a company in my experience. But if you can back it up with survey or user testing, and it's literally the voice of the customer saying that, oh, it would be great if we just did X, Y, or Z, and then finding a way to kind of validate it. So typically for me, A/B testing is really about a validation, and it's kind of at the end of the process. So we go through this whole process of collecting user feedback around our offerings and our value proposition, and then seeing which kind of themes are consistent. And then the other component I would say too, this was when I was still a kind of consultant on A/B testing, but working with a car rental company, one of the things that we learned from people was that they would choose a car only to get to the next step to then find out that car wasn't available. So we were able to basically take some information that was one step away and bring it further up into the funnel. And when people would actually find the car that were available that they wanted, conversion rates went through the roof as well. It was like 100% increase in reservations. So just looking for some of those things that might be obvious, but might make a really big difference to the people that are using our products.
They're obvious to the customers, but they're not always obvious to the business, because the business is coming at it from a business focus and the customers. So if you really have to get in the head of their customers to design customer-centric tests.
Yeah, and customers, analytics and numbers and spreadsheets, they're all abstract numbers. I think I may have mentioned this last time, but understanding the people on the other side of the screen is the most important part, because people are emotional beings and we make decisions based on instincts, all of these different decisions. And we're not just, 100 people made it here and then 75 people made it there. It's understanding those underlying drivers for people that are going to make them choose whether or not to engage with your business.
Yeah, when I first got into testing, we were still trying to figure out if concurrent tests really conflict, if they were on 2 different parts of the site. And in this particular example, they wanted to run one test on the homepage at the same time that they were running a test in the checkout. And everybody did, like the statistician. We actually had a statistician on staff at Circuit City, and he actually ran the numbers, and he was like, "Oh, it's going to be fine because there's a random distribution and blah 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 blah." But what we found out was that it wasn't fine, and there was totally an impact. And we had to step back and really figure out why. And what turned out to be the problem was that the earlier funnel test was a horrible experience for the customer. And even though we simplified the cart so that they could check out easier, by the time they got there, they were really angry, and they might have checked out anyway. They did check out anyway, because they spent all this time doing this thing that we had made them do that was really complicated and horrible. It was like getting slapped by a bunch of people. And then they went to check out. They didn't really care if it was easier to check out. They just had a shitty experience. So they were going to check out anyway. But they weren't going to be influenced by the little thing that we did. So it added noise to the data because they were in a bad mood, and that is just not something that we think about, because if you look at the numbers, you ignore the fact that there's a human factor in this. And one other thing I want to point out, and I can't remember which one of you was saying something when it made me think of it. I think it was you, David, when you were talking about the right the right message to the right people. If you guys are familiar with the what is it called, the marinara study? Is like several years ago, back when you'd go to the shelf and like Ragu had one option, and then other companies had other options. And I don't remember if it was Ragu or one of the other companies, but they actually hired somebody to say, find the perfect marinara for America. And they went out and they did all these taste tests. And the results of that is what you see on the shelves today, which is they came back and they said, there is not one right marinara or one barbecue sauce or one whatever. There's a whole bunch of different right ones and different right coffee flavors, and because people are different and they have different interests and likes. The same is very much true with the customers on our website. So if a test doesn't work, dive deeper and look at the levels, look at your segments. We always talk about segmentation and analysis. We've got to think about it in testing as well. And one of the biggest lifts that I've ever seen in any test anywhere was when we flipped the switch with an A/B test, and we said, you know what, let's turn this into a self-optimizing machine learning campaign and see if maybe the problem was, based on the analysis we did, it was clear that if we looked at it at a segmentation level, we had a huge lift. So we let machine learning take over and send the appropriate content to the appropriate segments. And our conversion rates went through the roof, and it happened over Black Friday. So that's why it was such a big deal. So I would encourage folks, when I mention machine learning, self-optimizing, multi-arm bandits, when I use those words to folks that are new to testing, or even folks that have been doing it for a long time that haven't tried it, they get like deer in headlights. They're scared, and they don't need to be. It's not a scary thing. It works really well, and it's a great way to offer a personalized experience without having an official personalization tool.
And oftentimes it's easier because you could always just blame the system.
Yeah, well, it chose wrong. All right, any questions over here on I'm looking on the chat over here. Matt's laughing, no surprise there. Any questions you guys want me to make sure to cover? You can go off mute or you can ask in the chat. We've got about 5 minutes remaining. While you guys are thinking about that, I will remind you, for those of you who have received the link to the code of conduct but have not finalized it, please do so. We're missing about 30 people, and I need to have you guys sign that so that we're all on the same page about the purpose and the code of conduct for the TLC. And if I don't get those kind of soon, I'm gonna have to start sending you little nasty grams so that I get everybody signed, because I want to make sure that everybody follows the code. And then secondly, a reminder about November 10th conversation. The November 10th conversation is about third-party data. So it should be fun. Bring your coffee. Okay, I do have a question. Can you give a little bit more information about the confidence booster strategies for low traffic sites? That's a great question. All right, so you got a site that's got low traffic and you want to get to some kind of statistical significance or ability to make a decision. What experience do you guys have with that, and what have you done to address that?
So I could take a first crack at it. It's also going to repeat an answer that I gave earlier, but when dealing with low traffic, I try to look for other metrics that are correlated. So if it's a funnel and you're looking for conversion to checkout, looking further up the funnel. In the past, it's been something like adding something to the cart tends to be highly correlated with somebody actually checking out. We tend to then focus on people going to adding something to cart instead of always worrying about checking out. And if you do have lower traffic site, I think it's even more important to making sure that the tests that you run have a potentially high lift, because if you have a high lift, it'll become very obvious very quickly, even with low sample, that you have a winner on your hands. So it might take a little bit more effort to kind of get over that risk aversion factor. But if you can do that. Trying those new things out, trying something where people might feel like it's very risky, but giving it an opportunity to test it out. The bigger the lift, the less sample you need.
Yep.
Yeah, I would agree with David. I think if you're at the point where you have such low site traffic, and regardless of what measurements you use, you still have low traffic. Color tests and smaller copy tests, you're never going to see anything. I mean, a lot of large traffic sites don't see a lot of change. So you're going to want to start going after the tests that have a significant difference in behavior between the variation and the original. And I think that those are really the only tests that you're really going to be able to see any sort of confidence in if you really have that low of traffic. And I think it's worth being said too, I know this isn't ideal, but if there's certain things that you want to try and there's just no way the site traffic is going to allow you to get to confidence, sometimes it's okay, depending on what you're trying to test, to do a pre-post test and not split the traffic. And there are some times when we feel that something doesn't need to be rolled out as an A/B test. We're actually just going to monitor it as a pre-post. That could be, that's a very light guiding light versus a nice, strong, statistical confident test. But at least it's not holding you up from making a change that you can't test because of your traffic.
Not ideal, but it is possible.
True. Depending on what it is, it's not ideal. That's true. But I think there's a lot of situations where you can roll something out without A/B testing it. You shouldn't be A/B testing everything.
Yeah. I would just say to close this out, the last thing you said is probably the most important. We don't need to be A/B testing everything. And I would argue that if you have a part of the site that no traffic is getting to, that's less important to your bottom line, that kind of thing, then maybe it's not the right candidate for a test. But for companies that have nothing but low traffic or a super high bounce rate or something like that, and you still want to optimize, it doesn't mean you can't test. To David's earlier point, you do need to focus on being more customer centric. Why are your customers there? What are they trying to do? And what kinds of big changes can we make to that experience? That's going to give you the bigger lift. And then also, like they already mentioned, picking the right KPI so that you can make sure that you actually see that lift. All of those things combined will give you a better lift. And Anna, to your question about how do we define low traffic, I would say that if your traffic and your whatever selected KPI are so low that you would need to run a test for more than 2 months, then that's low traffic. So then you have to start looking at other methods to getting your impact. And maybe it's usertesting.com or similar. Maybe it's a voice of customer. Maybe it's, selecting a bigger test, bigger impact, better KPI. But all of those are methods you can use to getting the better lift. So we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank my panel. You guys were great. I really appreciate it. It was an interesting conversation. I hope everybody else got as much out of it as I did. And I look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.